1 week into South Africa's government of national unity, and the drama is already unfolding. Let's get into all of that in this episode of SMWX. Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. If you're new around here, I'm Mpofu-Walsh, and on this channel we explore South African politics. Well. It's been a while since we last spoke, last week, and the government of national unity, so-called, is 1 week into its life. There's been a lot happening, so in this episode I want to break down what we saw over the last week and what we can expect to come this week in South African politics. So I'd like to break this down into 3 parts. The first is what has happened that we need to keep an eye on and that is important. And then what is going to be happening this week that is important. And then finally, look at things from the perspective of opposition politics as well, and not just the government. So let's get into it. Now, we saw on a few occasions some cracks beginning to show in this coalition government. And the first place we saw a crack emerging was, of course, in Gauteng, where Premier Panyaza Lesufi was unable to bring the DA into his provincial government, and we have a minority government in Gauteng. Now, this just gives the lie to this idea of a government of national unity, because you can't have a government of national unity that's also a minority government. That just takes the idea of a government of national unity to absurdity, right? The idea of a government of national unity is that it represents a large scope of the electorate, more than a normal majority government. But if it's a minority, then how is it unifying? Anyway, people continue to use this term, so there you go. But Gauteng, I think, is a fascinating case study in that it is showing that the ANC and the DA are not fully aligned and have not been able to implement their strategy of political cooperation across the country. And yes, they may have done it in Cabinet and KZN, but there is still a lot of friction in this relationship. And I watched very closely some of Helen Zilla's interviews in the build-up to the Gauteng situation. And it's clear to me that there is a split in the DA, or maybe a split is too strong a term, but there is a diverging set of opinions on whether the DA actually got enough out of this deal. I think Zilla, it seems to me, feels that there was a complete lack of regard for how much the DA brought to the table and how much they actually got. So they should have got more within Cabinet than they got. The ANC completely disregarded any notion of proportionality and really dominates the Cabinet, the deputy ministries, and of course now Gauteng. And so I think there's a strand in the DA that feels that they were able to compromise too much. There's another strand, of course, which views this as a great opportunity to govern, to demonstrate to people that DA ministers can actually produce tangible outcomes and results. And even if they get a smaller share of the cabinet, then that's okay, because it's a unique opportunity to demonstrate their capacities to govern. But Gauteng clearly showed that that viewpoint also has its limits. And if the DA is only going to get 2 or 3 MEC positions in the Gauteng provincial government, then they feel that the ANC is actually just using the DA for this notion of unity, when in actual fact they're dominating government as they did before. I must say, I find it a little underwhelming and anticlimactic that in Gauteng, which is the province in which I live, although the voters delivered a massive change and struck the ANC down to 30% from 50, it is still quite disappointing that the ANC, which has been voted out by nearly 70% of voters didn't vote for the ANC, they now dominate the government and are governing exactly like they did before when they had a majority. There's something undemocratic about that outcome, and a minority government in Gauteng will be very unstable. And so I think political parties in this province have really failed to honor the will of the electorate. The ANC has been stubborn in wanting to hold on to power, maybe when it doesn't deserve that power. And opposition parties have failed to make a case to the ANC of how power can be shared. And now citizens are stuck with this unworkable, in my view, minority government. So that was the one thing we saw. We also saw Minister Khumbudzo Ntshavheni coming out and explaining where we see the next steps for this cabinet. And there will be a really important Cabinet Lekgotla, which we'll get onto a bit later. But Ntshavheni said something that I thought we actually had to deal with and confront, because her quote was, given the electoral outcome and the government to form a government of national unity, it was therefore no longer possible for the president to fulfill the undertaking he had previously made to reduce the number of portfolios in the national executive. Basically blaming voters for the fact that we now have to have this swollen, bloated cabinet. So because there has to be a government of national unity, it was impossible to cut the size of cabinet. Now, this was a promise that was made not just in this election, but in previous elections, not just by the ANC, but also by opposition parties, that they would cut the cabinet. But when push came to shove, they actually decided that, no, we will actually expand the size of the cabinet so that we can all make sure that we have more power. And I think it's unfortunate for government to try and place the burden on voters and say that it's our fault that they had to have this big cabinet. The fact of the matter is, the president decides the size of cabinet. It's fully within his power to cut cabinet, and he chose not to for political reasons. And he should live with that broken promise rather than trying to suggest that it's somehow voters' problem that they voted the ANC out of a majority. So I found Minister Ntshavheni's comments curious, and also resting on a contradiction, because you'll remember that when the ANC was negotiating with the DA, they were saying it's the president's prerogative. What does that mean? It's the Constitution gives the president the power to make this decision. So the president has full power to decide who the ministers should be. But then Minister Ntshavheni turns around and says, well, he couldn't cut the size of cabinet because of external political considerations outside the presidency. So which one is it? Do external political situations constrain the president, or does he have full constitutional power? You can't talk about the prerogative 1 minute and then when it doesn't suit you, abandon this idea of constitutional power to the president. So I do think that this expanded national executive, the cabinet is roughly a similar size, maybe a little bit bigger, and the cabinet is just the ministers. But the national executive is the deputy ministers, and this is where the ANC, really took things to obscene proportions, in my view. What we have also seen, though, is clearly that markets are liking this new coalition government. That's something that cannot be denied at this moment. Now, when we look at markets, we can look at the stock exchange, for example, which I think was up 2% from the election period. So clearly, South African stocks are in a good position and liking or reacting, but it's all very short term at the moment. But that was predicted, that the markets would get a short term sugar rush out of this government, and we've seen that. Probably the most important market metric is yields on 10-year government bonds. Now, what does that mean? Because you probably hear it spoken about in various places. Okay, so if I give you money and you're going to pay me back, right? If you're a very unsalutary character, or if I don't trust you, then the interest that would be paid back is going to be high, right? Because it's very risky to give money to a body that you don't trust. So that's how you can think of the yield on a government bond. You want that to come down because that means that government will be paying back interest that is lower, and therefore people trust the government more, right? So if yields on government bonds go very high, then it means when government has to pay back that money, it's paying back higher and higher interest costs. Fam, I just wanted to interrupt this episode to let you know the 4 ways you can help SMWX. Way number 1, you can invite me to speak at your institution or company. Way number 2, you can advertise on this channel. Way number 3, you can become a member of this channel. The link to the membership is down below. And number 4, you can buy merch, that's books or hoodies. Now let's get back to the episode. All our contact details are in the description box below. So in South Africa, yields on 10-year bonds have actually been creeping up over time and have been, I think they approached like 11% or something, or the high tens, which was concerning because it was higher than it had been in quite a while, and the trend was upwards. And now we've seen with this new coalition government that yields on government bonds have fallen below the 10% mark, which is a good sign. But what I would also say is, don't just look at short-term markets and financial markets. It's clear that they like what's happening, but I think that was always predictable. The real test for this government will be in the long and the medium term. Can they create market confidence? Can they create economic and business confidence? Can they create certainty so that long-term trends push in the right direction? The rand, I think, after some fluctuation going up and down, is also down against the dollar. So that's what we saw over the last week, and I think those are some of the key things to bear in mind. Number one, we've seen cracks in the coalition arrangement or the cooperation agreement between the ANC and the DA, which showed themselves in Gauteng. We've seen strange statements from Cabinet that it's somehow voters' fault that Cabinet is bloated. And we've also seen positive market sentiment towards this coalition government. So that just sets the stage now for our next part, where I want to talk about what is coming up and what you need to look out for this week as we make sense of South African politics. The first thing that I would look out for is there's going to be a big meeting of the new cabinet, which is called the Cabinet Lekgotla, which will be happening on Thursday and Friday. And I find this fascinating because it will be the first time that a coalition cabinet of this kind has come together and will set its priorities. And this will be one of the key tests to establish whether this cabinet that has just come together can actually be a coherent force, can actually govern and can actually deliver the kinds of benefits to South Africans that it has promised. Now, a couple of things that I'll be looking for. One is, what kind of policy platform is this new cabinet going to stand on? I've seen some suggestion that they're going to orient their proposals around the National Development Plan, which seems to have fallen into disrepair. That will be interesting to see. Will opposition parties like that? Is it wise to continue down this road of a plan that an ANC government established in 2010, I think it was? Or will this new coalition cabinet try to forge a new collective agreement? Or will they use the NDP as this kind of stopgap plan while they create a more established and elaborate plan of their own? So I'm interested to see exactly how the divergent policy perspectives come together around a coordinated plan, and it'll be fascinating to see whether government can do that. What kind of priorities will this cabinet set for itself collectively? What will be the 3 or 4 most important policy goals? I understand that various directors general in departments have been sitting down with different manifestos of these different parties and trying to reconcile them around a common program. So let's see. Or will this be the first sign that there are ideological irreconcilable differences and that government won't be able to harmonize around a particular plan? So I'd be watching very carefully, and I think this will be the most interesting Cabinet Lekgotla that we have yet seen because of how many different forces and parties come together around the table. Now, the other question for me is, will President Ramaphosa be able to create a unified cabinet? Will he be able to use this Lekgotla opportunity as a chance to set political scores aside and try to build a united team? Or will we see, an attempt to undermine his credibility and his leadership from opposition parties within the cabinet? Will we see opposition parties using the information now that is at their disposal about their departments and their ministries, and maybe even past examples of corruption, for example? Will we see them being able to use that and leak that? Will we see this culture of leakage from cabinet continue, or will we see a tighter ship where the government speaks with one voice? And will President Ramaphosa be able to unite that cabinet and, become a kind of magnetic force within that cabinet So that'll be interested to watch and see as well. What information comes out of that? How will the government be trying to position itself? But how will opposition parties also be trying to position themselves outside of that? Because what we have seen, particularly with DA ministers, is they have a sophisticated communications capacity. They know how to communicate their victories and suppress their defeats. And we already saw that in the first week of the Government of National Unity, where DA ministers really rushed out of the starting blocks, suggesting some PR victories and, in superficial ways, admittedly, but kind of made it look like they were busy and they were working. I've seen this really interesting DA strategy, which now I've figured out, which is someone comes into office and then they identify some crisis that they are going to solve. It's usually to do with some kind of mafia. And so the DA minister or the MEC comes in and then he identifies a mafia that she identifies a mafia that needs to be tackled. And then they say that only the DA has the bravery to address this mafia. So we've seen this with MECs in KZN, and we also saw this with the Public Works Minister talking about dealing with mafias. It's an effective communication strategy. Exactly what this mafia is, how it works, who the members are, remains vague. But look, I fully agree. Tackling corruption, tackling powerful and even violent business elites is important. But it's a big task, and I'm not sure whether in just a few weeks, one should set up the goal of being able to eradicate these very established networks. But it's also a powerful communications tactic to say, hey, we're coming in and we're taking down the bad guys, as it were. So the DA knows what it's doing communications-wise, and we saw Home Affairs, Education, Public Works ministers coming out and really communicating, taking lots of interviews and trying to set the tone. Whereas ANC ministers, I think, took more of a backseat. They're trying to still figure things out. And so the DA, I think, went on the front foot in this week. Now, will that create a sense in government in which there's a healthy competition, which I can see happening and which would be great? Or will it cause some tension in which cabinet ministers from other parties think that the DA is trying to hog the limelight? All eyes will be on the president on the 18th of July, which is next week Friday, when he delivers his opening of parliament address. This is kind of like the State of the Nation, but it's happening again because it's after the election, where President Ramaphosa will now have to come before the nation, having undertaken this Cabinet Lekgotla, and present a coherent plan to the people of South Africa in just, I think it's next week Friday or so, which convinces us that this government is coherent, it knows what it's doing, it has key priorities, and it can set the nation at ease. That government has a strategy, it has the tactics to go with that strategy, and we can start addressing poverty and inequality, unemployment, housing, education, healthcare crises, crime. We've got a number of crises on our hands, and I think we've all been distracted by the political brinksmanship and maneuvering. But now it's time for government to deliver, and deliver clearly on its promises. So that's what we can expect coming up. Now, to take a look at opposition politics, what we've seen is opposition parties, I think, coming together to re-strategize and re-plan. The MK party itself went on a kind of Lekgotla of its own. We saw the resignation of another SG in the MK party, but it didn't seem to be a particularly acrimonious resignation. Now, the MK party has its work cut out for it as well, because we have this opening of parliament address that's going to be happening next week. What kind of posture will the MK party be taking in parliament? This will be really the first time where the nation gets to see what the MK party will do. Are they going to follow some kind of disruptive strategy like we saw with the EFF? We know that the EFF has said they're moving away from this disruptive strategy. Will they stay true to that? So it'll be quite interesting to see what posture MK adopts. Now, of course, the big area of controversy around opposition politics is the question of Dr. John Hlophe's inclusion on the Judicial Services Commission. What does that mean? In a nutshell, the JSC is the body which appoints or selects South African judges. They make a recommendation to the president, who then ultimately makes the appointment. Now, of course, Dr. Hlophe is impeached. He was impeached by Parliament as a judge. And so the debate and the question is, can someone who was impeached for the office of judge sit as a member of Parliament to select judges? Now, I think it's a legitimate debate, and I'm not so sure that either side has a complete victory in this debate. I'm still trying to figure out where I stand on it, because yes, impeachment is a serious removal from office, and it should carry serious consequences. But on the other hand, there are different ways of delivering to the state, and being a judge is different to being an MP. And there's nothing in the Constitution that says when you are impeached from one office, I think except the president, if the president is impeached, I think that they're unable to stand for public office, or I must actually check that out. But what is clear is that there's nothing that seems to suggest that if you're impeached as a judge, you can't serve as an MP, which is precisely why Hlophe is in Parliament right now. But also that you can't then discharge your duties as an MP. So Hlophe isn't going to the JSC as a judge. He's going there as an MP to represent a constituency. And part of the wisdom of the JSC is that, yes, there are technical experts and there are voices from the legal profession and the judiciary there, but that is balanced against the voices of political constituencies, and in particular the voices of opposition party constituencies. And those voices really matter because they lend legitimacy to the JSC, so that it's not just a body where NGOs get to decide who judges are, who have absolutely no public support. But political parties who are voted by the people actually get to have a say over who becomes a judge. And we know that judges are extremely powerful. And so the MK's capacity to deploy the person that it chooses to Parliament comes from the power that voters have given it. And so there is a counter argument to suggest that the MK party can send who it likes to the JSC, and people might not like it, but unless there's some kind of express provision against that person going, there's no legal impediment to Hlophe going. Now, I've heard NGOs, for example, like Judges Matter, saying they don't see any legal impediment either, but this is an ethical question, and this is a question about protecting the JSC. Okay, so that's a different argument. I'd be interested to see if they do try to take it to court, having said, or if anyone tries to take it to court, having made that concession. But is there an ethical problem? I think that's a different debate. The debate is it permitted for Hlophe to go to the JSC? And I think KSAC and Freedom Under Law wrote to the Speaker to say it would be irrational. If they are using that language, maybe perhaps they think that there's a legal basis. I have heard a spokesperson for Freedom Under Law saying, if we read the Constitution in context and we look at the protections that are given to the judiciary and the need to insulate the JSC from outside interference, then maybe some constitutional argument can be mounted, but it feels like it's built on a lot of inferences and a lot of jumps. So I think that debate will rage on. But what I would also say, politically speaking, not necessarily legally speaking now, is that even though, we're in uncharted territories in terms of an impeached judge being a member of Parliament, remember that the MK party has always thrived on these narratives of persecution. And what I think they will do is similar to what they did so effectively in the election, is that if this matter does go to court and there's an attempt to, kick Hlophe off the JSC, the MK party will use those court cases to create this narrative that they've already been isolated in parliament. They're a threat to the establishment. They're a threat to the system. There's something deeper. There's a personal dislike of the people within the MK, and then they can use that to their political advantage. So just as I cautioned that there would be a political implication of the Zuma decision and the Zuma disqualification, which turned out to be true because the MK did extremely well in the election, I think at a time, again, when the MK party is fragile, if people circle around Hlophe and create him into this hated figure beyond his impeachment and say he can't serve on certain committees, that is going to galvanize the parliamentary caucus, and it's going to galvanize the MK party at a time when they might be fragile. Fam, you asked for some SMWX merch, and we have delivered. I know you're always looking for ways to help support and grow this channel, so why don't you buy yourself an SMWX hoodie? Super comfy, super warm, and you can represent SMWX. You can check the link down below for how to buy your SMWX hoodie and help build and grow this channel so we can bring you more interviews, more analysis, and more educational insights. Now let's get back to it. So that's clearly a debate. It's one that we can continue to have on the channel. Let me know what your thoughts are. I have mixed feelings about the question. Then we also have a question in terms of opposition politics and indeed the government about parliamentary committees. Which parliamentary committees are going to sit? I believe that it's been decided that there are now 30 committees, 11 members, 4 ANC, I think it's 2 DA, 2 MK, 1 EFF, and then 1 member from smaller parties to be divided among the different committees. This is going to be a key test for the government of national unity, so-called, to the extent that they're going to have to divide committee chairpersonships, and I think they're going to try and bring in other smaller parties and distribute chairpersonships to those committees to keep certain smaller parties that aren't in the executive on side. So I think you could see a Rise Mzansi, for example, a Songezo Zibi maybe getting a chairpersonship. Will a Bosa and a Musi Maimane be able to exercise influence in committees? And then also, which ANC figures, which DA figures will chair committees? And might we see more power being shared in terms of committee chairpersonships than on the executive? Or will we still see the ANC trying to dominate as it has in other places and playing opposition parties off against each other while it keeps the majority of the power? There has also been talk about an oversight committee specifically for the presidency, and I think this would be a really good thing. It would ensure further accountability. It would keep the presidency in check and make sure that the president doesn't occupy this vacuum of accountability, given how much power the president already has. So that's a view from many different viewpoints of what has happened up to this point and what we can expect in this important political week ahead. I'll check in with you again later in this week and we can see some of the other things that have emerged on South Africa's political landscape. So far, we haven't had a political crisis yet. And remember, the government will be tested most when an outside unexpected crisis emerges. I see NUMSA seems to be galvanizing. They've had protests in various places. There's a Gautrain protest. There was a protest at a Ford factory recently. So will Labour give government its first real test, or will it come from somewhere else? There's an interesting geopolitical environment emerging. We've seen a changeover of government in the UK. We've seen a shock election in France, where it appears that a left-wing coalition will come to power. There's a big US election coming up. What will this government do with a Trump presidency or a Biden presidency or maybe even a Harris presidency? So this government is yet to be tested, and let's see how it responds when those tests come. But I think so far, although it has seen some problems in Gauteng, the coalition government seems to be holding up relatively well and relatively firm. But it's early days yet. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Let's continue this conversation. Help us get to 200,000 subscribers by the end of this year. You don't have to agree with anything I say. This is just a platform where I try to share some perspectives and some views, and we can have a further conversation down below in the comments. Thank you for watching SMWX. Share this with your grandfather, with your son, your daughter. Share it with your friend. Share it everywhere. Share it on that WhatsApp group. That WhatsApp group that people just always like to debate stuff on. Just share it there. It'll be the best thing to create debate in that group. And keep it locked on SMWX.